People love the internet, but data centers, sometimes not as much. We've seen a lot of headlines about data centers lately, especially controversies in communities considering large new data center campuses to support AI. Community resistance to data centers is not new, but it's escalated rapidly in recent months, with a number of projects being canceled or delayed amid community outcry, including some that represented billions of dollars in local investment. Today on Data Center Richness, our topic is community resistance to data centers. Our guest is Adam Waitkunas of Milldam Public Relations, who publishes a newsletter tracking data center controversies and how local communities are shaping the future of data center growth. Adam and I will discuss why we're seeing more of these controversies, some of the key factors in community resistance, and what data centers can do to change the narrative and address some of the concerns about AI development. It's an important topic and one we need to talk more about. Digital services are a growing part of our entertainment, business, and social lives, and that trend is going to continue. And data centers are the engines of this digital economy. Let's get started. Welcome to Data Center Richness. I'm Rich Miller, and I've spent 25 years telling the story of data centers, cloud computing, and AI infrastructure. In this podcast, I'm sharing conversations with the innovators building our digital future. Now, here's our show. Adam Waitkunas, welcome to Data Center Richness.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on was that we're in a period where large data center projects are sprouting up all over the place, and communities have to try and figure out what's going on with that. And that's something that you've been taking a look at in your newsletter. It's called Zoning In, which I think is a really useful source for uh, what's going on with community engagement in data centers. But I thought we could start by, you and I have worked together a number of times over the years, and maybe tell our audience a little bit about, what you do and your data center journey, and then we can talk about zoning in.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me on. So, I started Milldam Public Relations back in 2005. Was originally started as a public affairs issues management firm, and then I got dragged into the data center industry. I had no idea what a data center was, and I started working with a small airflow management company up in New Hampshire called Degree C Adaptive Cool. You may remember them from years ago. And from then on, that kind of started my journey within the data center space. So, worked a lot with vendors and started working with colos, doing traditional PR, and then branched out into doing more technical white papers and case studies and ghostwriting bylines for companies as well. And then, kind of utilizing my public affairs background, I started to see what was going on in the data center industry from the development side. And I think I may have done my first blog on it 5 years or so ago. Kind of, there's going to be a need for data center community relations. And then Milldam launched a specific data center community relations practice, drawing on my experience in the data center industry, but also my political and public affairs background. And here we are today with lots of data center community relations issues, so much that I have to, figure out which articles I can eliminate in our weekly zoning in update because there's so much going on at the local level on a weekly basis.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about zoning in, and for readers who don't know it, what's the kind of stuff you cover?
So basically, zoning in's a roundup of all of the data center zoning, regulatory, and political issues that are happening at the local level. There's so much going on, so I kind of did it for two reasons. Number one, to keep the industry up to date on what's going on throughout the country when it comes to local opposition and other um, pushback to data centers. But the other reason too was to help data center companies strategize on what they might be up against in areas that they're going into. There's so much going on, and I think a really good example of how political things are turning is in DelCap County, Georgia. A few weeks ago, there was a political action committee launched to try to unseat a pro data center commissioner. So I think that just shows how far things have come in just a short period of time. And I think it's only going to continue. And that's why it's important for the industry to be up to date on what's going on, but also really take data center community relations um, seriously.
Yeah, I think that's an important issue. I think the first time I wrote it, as you know, I've been tracking the data center industry for a lot of years. And I think 2014 was the first time I wrote about one of these disputes. It was at a project in Delaware where the community there were a lot of professors at the local university who were interested. That project involved an energy plant. Since then, there have been these sort of, I guess, playbooks that evolve where you see very sort of uh, common formats for the sort of resistance that pops up. But I think to start out with, one of the things that I've really been struck with recently is that we're starting to see more and more projects actually be sidelined, voted down, have to go back to the drawing board in one way or the other because the resistance, the controversies in the community have become so pronounced. And that I think is relatively new. Obviously, the a lot as with a lot of things, that the timing of the scaling up of this seems to coincide with when ChatGPT came out, and all of a sudden there was more demand for AI capacity. What do you think has changed in the last couple of years, and what's the sort of status quo now for community relations and how data centers are experiencing it?
Well, I think number one, for so many years, data centers, we're operating under the radar, relatively speaking, not getting much coverage in mainstream publications. Mostly, it was a trade play. And then there were, I think right when I met you and right after I got started in the industry, there was a huge drive towards sustainability and energy efficiency, mostly, due to costs and other factors as well. And there were a couple of Wall Street Journal articles, New York Times pieces equating energy to air travel and that sort of thing. But that was kind of the extent of the coverage. But as you mentioned, in the last couple of years, the mainstream coverage has just ballooned, especially with the proliferation of AI. So you have kind of different stories out there about how much energy the data center industry is using, how much water they're using, how much of a footprint they're taking up. So I think that additional coverage and, to a certain degree too, local folks not having all the facts about data centers is one side. And then I think too, you know, there's been more development in suburban bedroom communities where it's a different play when you're dealing with the local communities there. You kind of have a more, sophisticated residency there, folks with more money, more resources, more time to spend, I think, on fighting these developments coming in. So that's another ingredient there. So, maybe years ago you could say, okay, we're going to, donate, you know, $250,000 to the local school and they'll take a check. But just kind of given the tax base that these local communities have and kind of the demographics of the community, just simply writing a check isn't going to kind of make it a seamless process. So I think that the strategy has to be refined a bit in those areas there. And then it's a completely different ballgame as you get out into rural areas and farmland that the data center developers are acquiring too. And, I noticed another point I'd make is just kind of the bipartisan nature of the opposition, too. It's kind of making for strange political bedfellows, where you have kind of Republicans and Democrats coming together at the local and state level to oppose some of these projects. And, traditionally you've had kind of a Republican Party's been more of a pro business party, but there's kind of a populist surge within there now. So you're seeing that out in some of the rural areas. So I think those are some of the battles that the data center developers are up against now.
Yeah, and one of the things that I see in your coverage and zoning in is that there's disputes taking place at a number of different levels here. Sometimes it's just community members who, will show up at, meetings or at the data centers themselves and make their concerns heard. Sometimes it's a planning or zoning board level thing. And then we also have some issues that rise to the utility level or to state government. And I want to talk a little bit about each of those, and maybe what some of the your thoughts are on how data center developers can work with communities or what they ought to be thinking about in these kind of situations. Let's start with the community organizing. You have lots of times where there might be activists, concerned citizens, read something about data centers, become concerned, and start mobilizing. How often is that the kind of scenario you see, and what should maybe data center developers be thinking about as they enter a community?
So I think that seems to be the biggest roadblock right now. Would say in conjunction with kind of city and county officials. It's kind of in conjunction now. And the local citizens are mobilizing using social media, letters to the editor and the paper. So it's a combination of kind of new technology, but then also, a lot of these local communities still have print newspapers getting delivered weekly, and they're utilizing that too, which I think a lot of the data center developers aren't following. That's why um, I've really been talking about how important it is to localize all of these campaigns when data centers are going into an area. Since all of these communities are very different, there's no kind of, I would say, single playbook that can be used um, to face when facing these issues. So I would say that, but I think the number one thing that data centers need to do is really um, be transparent about their intent. I think a lot of times, I think the biggest issue I've seen is, not the data center coming in saying they're doing a project, but a intrepid reporter from a local business journal or regional newspaper will go and pull permit filings and other regulatory paperwork and break the story that way. So I think that's a huge issue that the data centers need to get a hold on right now. Before all of that's done, they need to be in, meeting with the community and also identifying issues and figuring out, what the community needs are. And then also kind of finding sympathetic voices on the ground in the community, almost as if you're building a local political campaign. So I think that's something that they can start doing to address this.
What are your thoughts on engaging with some of the critics? Is that valuable, or is it a case by case kind of thing? What how does that communications piece work out?
I think that that's important, although I think there are some opponents that are, very set in their ways and, you're not going to convince them at all. But I think that, in many cases, it's a good idea, to have a town hall with these folks and, just have take their questions and have the press there and, answer it. Because I think one of the biggest hurdles is just kind of that a lot of these local community members don't have all the information and they're hearing bits and pieces on power, water from all kinds of different sources. So I think if you have the data center representatives there in a town hall setting and just kind of taking, opening it up for questions from opposition, people that support it, I think that would go a long way. And it would also show that, that the developer cares about the community. They're not just coming in, looking at the bottom line. They really want to be part of the fabric of the community and not just to get the facility approved, but to continue it throughout the life of the data center.
One of the things that's tricky, even I think in those sort of scenarios where you're trying to build bridges, is the transparency issue and the fact that lots of times data center operators seem like they really don't want to make disclosures about how much local resources they're going to be using, power, and particularly right now, the hot button seems to be water, that communities really want to understand and quantify what having a data center in the community is going to mean for the resources that they use every day and their availability and their cost. Uh, how big an issue is that, and how do you sort of talk with the data centers operators about how transparent they can be?
Yeah, I think that that's an area where they need to, you know, bring the utilities on board, for these types of campaigns. So, the town hall that we just talked about a moment ago, I think having someone from the utility there, but I think it's also an opportunity to discuss, how the data centers can ensure, grid resiliency and actually improve how things are going, and also, the kind of investments that they're going to be making to ensure that the, grid's resilient. Utilities need to be in on a lot of these community relations um, campaigns and town halls as well. So I think it's important for them to kind of work together in many cases. And I understand about the not wanting to, divulge certain technical specs of the data center. So I think there has to be a balancing act there too. And I think, with regard to going in and talking about what kind of development they're going to be doing, if the reporters are getting this information already from public filings, it's already out there. So I think it's better to address these issues before they're out in the press, and you don't have a voice in that article. There's been, how many articles have we seen where they're talking about a new development and the data center operator says, yeah, we have no comment at this time, or some other type of answer like that. That doesn't, help in getting these through.
Well, it seems like one of the big issues that comes up time and again is just the notion of trust and closely related to transparency is the notion that because there's not full disclosures and data center operators are sometimes reluctant to say how much of these resources they're using, that it comes off as though they have something to hide, that they're not being forthcoming. And it seems to me that that's something that becomes a real challenge in these scenarios of trying to work with the community to understand the impact of the facility.
Yeah, like I said, there has to be a balancing act there. And, that's why I think the town hall is important, where, you're face to face with the opposition, and then also some supporters too, and kind of laying all of that out there. So I think as much information as they can put out there, they should be putting out there, especially the information that's publicly available. And a lot of that can be pulled from the public filings. So I mean, at a minimum too, at least, going and meeting with folks one on one. So maybe you call up, you know the local head of the conservation foundation, and before you're going into an area, talk to them about their concerns and get their feedback. So I think that even those little things go a long way in helping to build relationships, and then ensure that the process is smooth.
Now, in terms of town halls and advocacy with the community, what's your thought on the the best people to be doing that? Is it folks who are associated with the local project in the community, or on these kind of occasions, is it that you want the CEO or some sort of C-suite kind of presence there, or is that a case by case? What's your take on that?
I mean, I think it's case by case, but in most of those cases, you want someone, that's higher up within the company. But then you also want someone there that can, if need be, that can, speak to specifics around energy and water usage too. So whether that's someone within the company or the utility partner there, I think it's always because you're going to have folks in the audience that when you look at a lot of these places, there's some of these folks have pretty specific technical knowledge when they go to these town halls. So I think it's important to be able to, um, answer all of those questions fully in the, without giving away any secrets, of course. But I think that's important. But I think also, in some cases, having a utility representative at these um, meetings as well to give a level of comfort to the community, but then also speak from the standpoint of the utility and how it, actually will affect power or not.
Um, the sort of next level up is working with zoning planning boards, boards of supervisors, ultimately the folks who are going to approve the project. I think there used to be a period where data center operators and the developers would sort of say, yeah, you're going to have some community noise, but we want to work really closely with the public officials and make sure they're on board, and saw them as as sort of a distinct target audience for their messaging. Now that's a little bit more complicated, it seems to me, because um, I think we're in an environment where the people on these boards, the local officials, are hearing a lot of feedback from the community. What are you seeing in terms of the state of play and the challenges for or best practices too in working with local boards?
Well, yeah, I definitely think they're definitely hearing from their community, and that, when we were talking earlier about Georgia and the local pact that was set up specifically to unseat a sitting commissioner that's pro data center, I think that these local officials really are starting to take a second look and wondering, is my seat in jeopardy? Is this the best direction for the community if we're getting all this harsh feedback here? So that's why I think it's important, not only to engage these local zoning boards and regulatory bodies, but that's why it's also important to get the pulse of the you know local residents too, and be meeting with them. And then also, I've been saying this for a while too, looking for sympathetic voices of regular community folks. So, and that, and requires a bit of kind of combing through letters to the editor and other folks in the community to find those sympathetic voices. Because if you can build a coalition that, drowns out or neutralizes some of the noise from the opposition, that can be helpful. And, I think it's still to be determined whether, these opposition voices are a vast majority of the community, or are they just a vocal minority. So there may be some polling that could come into play as well, that the data center operators could commission too at the local level.
And like what telephone surveys, something like that, or what would that?
Yeah, where you have a polling firm that comes in, and asks a bunch of questions and kind of gets the pulse of the community that way. Um, just because it's really starting to turn into a political battle in many aspects, and it's bipartisan too, as we've seen in many cases. So it's really hard to navigate to some degree. And I think, as we talked about before too, you just have those different challenges when you're looking at the, suburban communities, rural communities, and then those that are more industrialized too. So that has to be taken into effect too. And I also think too, folks at the local level too, and these local office holders like to feel a bit of importance too. So if they're putting a stop to a large, project from an Amazon or Google or something like that, um, does that are they trying to, move up another rung in the political ladder? So those are all things that have to be taken into account too.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen in a couple of places is there have been sort of a shift in the weather where if I mean I can think of a couple right off the top of my head. Prince William County, at one point in Virginia, was actively soliciting and recruiting data center developments. The same for Henrico County down around Richmond. And over the past year or two, there's been sort of political shifts in both places where boards that had been historically, open to data center development have kind of shifted, and it's a more complicated landscape now. Are there specific things that are useful in terms of the kind of issues to talk about and how to engage with the local officials?
So I think it's really dependent on, what the area is. So, if you're looking in the, suburbs, especially in and around Virginia, I don't think that there's as much of an economic development story there. Just given that a lot of those places are bedroom communities. They're coming there, they enjoy their open space. So, you're not going to, so you have to come up with a different argument other than economic development there. Maybe there are some kind of conservation aspects that these data centers can start implementing as well. When you're more in a industrialized, zone, I think there's a lot of economic development opportunities there. There's a lot of opportunities to partner with schools. There's a huge drive, and I know a lot of the operators have been doing this already too, but partnering with the schools and getting more of the vocational and tech funding. So I think those are areas where they can partner too. And then also on the industrialized areas too, I think, highlighting the local workforce. So, who are the folks from the community that are going to be filling these jobs? And, highlighting them, putting local faces to the new development that's coming in. So I think those are a few ways to connect with the audience there.
One of the things that comes up often in terms of data centers dealing with local officials uh, is the non-disclosure agreements. With these code name projects, they come in, they want the local officials to sign NDAs. Uh, but I wonder if they understand how that kind of looks on the other side of the equation, where if you're a member of that community and the a local official has signed an NDA with a data center operator. What's your take on NDAs and when they ought to be used?
I think that goes back to the question of transparency. I see, I can, I know that there's a need for NDAs and all of that. I think when there are multiple, maybe developers bidding on one particular project, there was a technology park out in New York that is, I think it was recently announced what's going on there, but there were a number of different players involved in that. So I think in cases like that, and then there are, I know there are certain legal aspects that I can't speak to on when NDAs would be necessary, but I definitely think when the local citizenry, see that kind of shows a lack of transparency. Also, I think we just saw the whole Project Blue fallout in Arizona recently, so that kind of also doesn't enable the data center to come in and talk to local community ahead of time. You can't come in anonymously and say, "Oh, I'm a vice president with Project Blue." That's not really gonna fly. So I think that it inhibits the um, you know community relations aspect to a certain degree and doesn't enable that initial legwork that I think has to be done at the outset.
There's such a legacy of secrecy, I think, in the data center sector, going back to the early days when it was thought, well, you got to be you buttoned up about with the locations of the facilities and things like that, because the tenants, the customers, didn't want people knowing where their data center was. The whole security by obscurity thing. But I think when you have, like, a gigawatt campus coming in, and you're probably accepting tax breaks on it, that it's kind of a different picture.
Yeah, so I think that's with regard to the NDAs, I think that legal and the executive team need to sit down and determine, how important is this NDA to move forward. And I understand, in some cases, completely appropriate, but at the same time, the operators need to know that that's going to hinder a lot of the community relations work that has to be done ahead of time. Because I really think that getting in early and building these coalitions, building these relationships is important. We keep talking about AI and how AI is revolutionizing everything. It's not going to take the place of in-person contact with community relations and the relationship building that has to be done. So this is still a area where face to face is a must.
When you're working with somebody who's an operator or somebody in the data center industry who's having some of these challenges, well, what's your process in terms of working with folks?
So it really depends. So two ways. We'll either figure out what talk to them about what issues they're having, what the location is, and all that, and we'll design a specific playbook for that local area. And a lot of these data center operators, a number of them have public affairs individuals, community relations already in place, which I think is great, and I think is the direction that the industry needs to go in. So in some cases, we'll design essentially a local campaign for that area. In other cases, we'll design the campaign and then implement it too. So do grassroots organizing if necessary, find sympathetic voices within the community, do relationship building, set up and facilitate town halls, um, put together a media relations campaign for that local area too. And then also, I think it's still important too to, get letters to the editor into these local papers, especially when they're small communities and, people are waiting all week to get that, print edition on Friday afternoon and flip through. Oh, I know that person that just wrote that letter to the editor in there. And I think as we see more and more rural development, I think that, that personal contact is important.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about the media and press coverage of the industry. You and I are both people who've been seen that firsthand over a long period of time. What's your take on the press coverage of the data center industry, how that's evolving, and how much of a role that plays in some of the community engagement challenges we're seeing?
Right. So I think it has to be broken down into a couple of pieces. So the trade publications, the mainstream business publications, which, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Bloomberg, and then, what I'd say hyper local publications. So I think the trade publications are still covering a lot of what we'd call, technical stuff. And then they're also getting into a lot of the pain points that the data centers are facing on a kind of macro level. So the trades are covering that, but the mainstream business publications are doing more and more energy stories, and how doing covering a lot of the community pushback, especially when it's loud. When you get the clips on the local TV of folks yelling back and forth, so they're really starting to cover that. And especially on the energy angle, I think is where the mainstream business publications are really hitting. So that's there. And then you have the local press where I think there's a huge opportunity because a lot of these papers at the local level are short staffed, and the reporters, don't have a lot of knowledge about the industry, don't have a lot of technical knowledge. I think it's a really good opportunity for, and we all know that the all the major data center players have PR arms. I think it's a huge opportunity for them to go in and, you know, even start with a media relations campaign, introducing themselves to the reporter, talking about the development, what the benefits are. So I think media relations is a huge component of that. But even a lot of the stuff that's written locally, whether all the facts are there or not, or they know 100% about the development, a lot of that's getting reprinted by the bigger publications. So it's causing a PR issue for the industry as a whole at that level too. And I think all of the going back to the transparency part we just discussed, that's another issue that's causing a PR headache too.
And in terms of the understanding of the industry that comes through in all these stories about power and water, those are the ones I've particularly seen from the mainstream business publications, are how AI data centers are devouring the grid, or that data centers will dry up an entire state's water supply, these kind of things. Obviously, those narratives are working off of very real concerns in communities, but at the same time, the pattern I see, and I can speak to this, I think, as someone who's both written a lot about the industry and read just about everything that's written about it, is that there's a lot of these where the pain points, the controversy is up top, and the response to the data center folks is, if they've commented, it's down in the bottom, and sort of the we're squeezing this into to appear as though we've got both sides in it kind of narratives. Are there ways for that data center companies themselves to work with the larger business publications to start to change or at least update the narrative? Like, particularly on water, I feel like a lot of the coverage is behind where the industry is in terms of conservation and the water efficiency of some of these facilities.
Well, I think they have to be proactive, number one, but I also think getting a third party source to participate in the media campaign with them. So whether that's an analyst or someone from the utility, so it really needs to be coordinated. But you had mentioned in your point about the no comment or it's down at the bottom, and I've found more often than not, and especially with companies I'm working with too. I had a reporter from, I think it was the Financial Times that reached out a couple months ago, and I couldn't get a client to comment on the energy story. So I think that's an issue there too, and that kind of goes back to NDAs and talking about certain technology that the data centers are using, and kind of there's still a bit of industry, and some of the players are a little scared, I think, to talk about that. And I think that's a problem, because we're going to continue to the data centers are going to continue to get a little blurb down at the bottom. I was talking with a company a few weeks ago. This is kind of a regional newspaper, but they were getting, I thought that the reporter was kind of was showing a little bit of a bias in their writing when they were doing articles. And I suggested to the company to, seek out another reporter at the publication to, um, see about doing a story and inviting them to the data center, and kind of gave them some a strategy for going about doing that. So I think that's obviously easier at the local level, because it's very hard to control or kind of get more influence at the editorial level at some of these larger publications. But I think number one, the industry needs to, when they can, speak to these reporters, or it's not going to, the perception isn't going to change, the writing isn't going to change. If the reporter keeps getting no comment, no comment, no comment, or the company's dragging their feet getting back to them, the story's going to be written itself based on the sources that they have.
Are you surprised that there hasn't been, given the amount of money flowing through this industry and the size of the companies doing this, that there hasn't been any sort of collective concerted effort at media explanation resources that has helped puncture this narrative at all? Because I mean, we all see the numbers about how much is being invested here, and now we're seeing the numbers of the dollar value of some of the projects that are getting sidelined. I mean, it seems like there's it's not just about headline risk; it's business risk, right?
Right. And I think the issue is that there's not kind of one unified voice for the industry. There's a lot of different trade organizations out there, but there's not kind of a unifying message that all of the data centers have gotten behind. So I think that that's an issue too. There's trade groups looking at kind of bringing up the next level, the next new workforce. There's a trade organization looking at macro level public policy and all that, and then some other scattered organizations out there. So I think that not having one unified voice, so you have the reporters going out and seeing which data center operator they can talk to, just kind of going through their Rolodex and um, trying to find someone that'll comment on the record. I think it would be, I think that if some of these operators were more proactive um, with press relations on a larger scale, I think that that would be helpful. But then also bringing in third parties to validate what they're saying. So I think that's a way to pump up. There's a ton of, as there are a ton of analysts that are studying this every day. There are people at the utilities that can speak to what's going to happen with regard to power and water. So I think really, again, it goes back to that relationship building and putting these partnerships together.
Well, I can speak to a little bit to that in terms of as someone who, in the very early days of when we were getting started with coverage of the data center industry, one of the real challenges, and people have been very generous with their time and insights with me over many years, but there was always a sense when you spoke to people of like, does this reporter understand? Do they get it? And sort of level of understanding that folks are bringing to the table is important, because when you get into specialized media, the opportunity for the B2B journalists such as myself is to know the subject matter better, and so that you build up a record of trust where people might say, well, you can talk to Rich because he knows a few things about this, and frame the conversation that way, which is not as true when we have people coming in from either the local publications or the mainstream tech publications. And I talk to some of those folks too, and there's still a lot of the stories you see show that they're still coming up to speed on some of the key issues. Is there a way to work with that, or from your vantage point, how big of a problem is that, and are there ways to address it?
I mean, I think it's definitely still a learning curve at the mainstream business publications. That's why I think having a coalition, not necessarily a specific um, data center company representative, but kind of an industry figurehead and that can speak for the industry is important. And then you don't, then companies aren't worrying about any misrepresentation in the article, that sort of thing, or they can be brought in by the figurehead or what have you. They can have some data center companies within their database to call on for comment. But I still think I think there's that aspect, but I still think it's important for the data center operators to get out there more, because we're just going to keep running into this issue here. And I think it's important still, though, that they either have an internal PR person or someone on the outside that are vetting these reporters and vetting the inquiries. I also think it's a good role for design engineer firms to play as well. So it doesn't, specifically have to be the data center operator all the time. These design engineering firms are on the ground floor working, on these builds, working with the utilities and other folk players that are there. So I think it can be a good role for them as well to get in on these conversations.
I wanted to kind of close with your take on, obviously we're at a point where community engagement has become a much more visible issue. What do you see going forward? Is this going to continue to, rise up the food chain and be problematic for data centers trying to get projects built in places in terms of the industry response? What does the road ahead look like to you?
So I still see continued pushback going forward, and I see it at all of the different levels. So whether that's rural, suburban, industrial areas. And I think it's going to continue until, the data center industry and those developers going in, you know, increase the level of transparency with these projects. I think I know we talked about it earlier, but it's really important to, get in early, not only talking with, you know, city, county, town officials, but also getting the pulse of the townspeople that are there, meeting them, finding sympathetic voices. I think, getting in early and establishing these relationships are key. I think, if you're not on the, you know, if you're not at the table early, you're going to be on the menu later, I think is kind of the mindset that the industry needs to have going forward. And again, I would just add too, you know, it's very important to tailor these campaigns to the local dynamics. I think, you and I have both seen, developers going in with kind of a one size fits all approach, trying a community relations plan that works somewhere else, but is completely, not suitable for the place that they're going into now. So I think that getting the pulse and possibly initiating polling and that sort of thing is something they can add to their playbook.
That's a good place to wrap. Adam, listen, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your insights and experience with this. And maybe in a year or two we can come back and revisit and see whether things are any different.
Definitely, I'd love to, and it was great catching up with you again. And I hope to see you at a trade show in the coming months.
Many thanks for listening. If you like our content, you'll want to check out the Data Center Richness Substack. We're just now launching and have lots of great insights in the pipeline. If you're a data center professional or someone tracking the sector for your business, you will definitely want to check it out. I'm going to put a link in the show notes for the podcast and also in the description for the video on YouTube. And as always, if you've enjoyed the podcast, please give it a like. And be sure to subscribe to our channel, as this supports my work and ensures that you won't miss out on any of our insights from data center richness.